the different ways that we can write square roots. And so just like with a lot of different math components, instead of 12, I can write 3 times 4, or I can do 16 minus 4, just different ways of writing the exact same thing. So we want to kind of pay attention up here for our starters of our notes is this, what's called a radical sign, can also be written with a little invisible 2 here is basically what it is. So that means any number times itself twice is what we're looking at trying to get inside of here. And so we can basically pull it out. As you'll see over here is the example of that. That any number that has been squared, that when you take the square root of it, that's the magic number. This little 2 allows us to simplify it down to its root and the square root, which we've talked about in previous videos. So keep that in mind as we go through this, these notes, as we're looking at different ways to write basically the same thing when it comes to radicals. So the number c is a square root if if c squared equals a. So kind of a way to think about that if a number squared equals the value that is inside of the square root sign, then that means that this base number here is in fact its square root. So you'll see it initially as one of these 2 ways, that if 4 squared equals 16, that means 4 is the square root of 16. So it's kind of this forward and backwards thinking that you need to kind of have when you're looking at squares and square roots. So this symbol here is called a radical or the square root symbol. It's going to be interchangeable between those 2 terms. It just kind of depends on the conversation and what you just happen to say at that moment. So some other basic vocabulary words is that if you have any type of radical that looks like this, traditionally this is going to be a 2 in like our square root situations, but it could be a 3 for our cubes or 4 and etc., etc. That little n is actually called the index, and that's its name. Okay? The a, or the number that's inside of that radical sign, is the radicand. And so you might not hear that as much of the word, but that's its actual name and what it's called. So if it makes reference to factors of the radicand, then it's talking about the number that's inside the radical sign. So remember, you can pause the video at any time to copy these notes down. Moving along. So here's a really kind of important bit of information, because this is what we're going to be looking at in terms of different ways to write the same thing. Is that if x equals n square root a, then that is the same thing as basically x to that n will in fact equal the a. And again, it's that number squared or that square root. So kind of an example is that 4 equals the square root of 16. Well, then that means that 4 raised to the 2nd power is equal to the quantity 16. So if you think about it in terms of that, it's kind of like, oh, okay. And so it's important to kind of keep that, again, forward and backward bit of information in your mind when it deals with radicals. The next bit of vocabulary words that you kind of want to think about when you're working with radicals in our basics is what's called radical expressions. You'll hear this also. And that's whenever you have an expression that is written under or with basically a radical sign. So here's an example of this one here. Again, you can have a number outside, but it's still a radical expression because it includes a radical. And you can even have something that's a fraction or a quotient form and even more complex versions. But since it includes a radical, it's a radical expression. So if you hear that word, it's the same thing, it's what it means. So some other basic information when working with radicals is the fact that when you take a radical of a positive number, you'll in fact get what's called a real number. It's a number that can exist. Let's say the square root of 16. Well, that's 4 times 4. Or -4 times -4. Those are both real numbers, and so in fact the square root of 16 in that situation would be a real number. But if you have a negative sign out here, you're going to get what is called an imaginary number, because there's no number when you square it gets you a negative answer, because a positive times a positive is a positive, a negative times a negative is still a positive. And if you have a -3 and a +3, well, then those aren't identical numbers, and they have to be identical in order to be able to call them squared. So you'll get into this more later in terms of what's called the imaginary numbers, or I, in future references. But for right now, we're just introducing the concept and the vocabulary words behind it. So some other basic information when it comes to simplifying, or excuse me, dealing with square roots, is that you can actually see a square root in what's called a quotient form or a fraction form. So you could see this, you could see this, 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 and this. And they all actually mean the same thing. So this is where we're talking about different ways of writing the same thing. Well, believe it or not, our traditional radicals and square roots, where some power here, a to some power here, can actually be written also in this form. Notice my m doesn't change, it just moves outside the parentheses. It can be written as this form here, where we actually move the n out and get rid of the square root. We can switch those and it still means the same thing. Or we can combine them. Because the fact that m is basically a number on top, you could do m times 1 over n, and you get this number or view here. So they look a little confusing at first, but what's important to note is that this here is the same thing as this guy over here. And if you kind of start making that connection, and once you recognize that, and then these are just, again, different ways of writing all the same format. So regardless if m is a 3, well, then you would have a 3 here, a 3 here, a 3 here, and a 3 here. If n was a 2, then you'd have the 3 here and the 2 here. 3 and the 2. The 3 and the 2, or the 3 and the 2. So these are different ways of writing the same exact thing. And you can interchange them between there. So again, pause the video as needed to get this information down. And last but not least, of some of the basic components needed for our working with square roots is our, well, initial perfect radicals. So if x is raised to the second power, and it's the second radical out here, then that equals x to the 1. If you have some number raised to the third, and we're taking the third root, then that simplifies down to, again, it's the same thing as x to the 1. These are basically whole numbers. Kind of like if you had 2 divided by 2, that equals 1. 3 divided by 3, that equals 1. Because if you think about this as 3 and that is 3, and it's the same thing as this one here, then you end up with just a to the 1. And that's what's happening in all these situations. My m, my n, divided by each other equals 1. And here, though, if we get leftovers, which we'll go more into, we can be able to take it out, and you'd end up with a group of 1, 3 over 3, but still have 2 left over. And again, we'll go more into that, but at least want you to have that basic note written down. All right, I hope this helped.